Morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's now 10:10. It's not yet the full academic quarter, but I think nevertheless we should set the ball rolling because otherwise we're only losing our time. Let me first of all welcome and thank all the speakers here on the panel who will be giving their views on the subject of horizontal subsidies and overcapacity today, and also to welcome to Gary Horlick, who will be moderating the debate. All of you are well-known experts in the area of subsidies, and I'm sure that the perspectives you'll be bringing today to the subject will be illuminating to all of us. Obviously, we're also grateful to hear the views of the participants in the seminar, so that side of the podium. We're grateful to hear your views during the two question and answers sessions we'll be having during the day. We, the European Union, as well as a number of co-sponsors for this of the seminar, have arranged today's event because we believe that industrial overcapacity is a major and growing cause of distortions to international trade, because it negatively affects the economic situation of those countries in which the overcapacity occurs, but also, of course, the third countries whose industries are affected by the resulting oversupply. Subsidies are one of the main contributors to overcapacity that has been recognized by the global leaders. Already during the G20 presidency of China in 2016, the trade ministers and the heads of government recognized, and I quote, that subsidies and other types of support from governments or government-sponsored institutions can cause market distortions and contribute to global excess-capacity and therefore require attention. End of quote. Now, clearly, not only the WTO, but also other international fora have a role in addressing this issue of overcapacity. But having said that, the WTO has a central role to play, given the broader trade mandate of the organization, as well as the wider membership of the WTO. It goes much beyond G20. And, of course, given the fact that in this House we have a specific agreement on subsidies, the ASCM. That is why the EU, last year already, but also in April of this year, we have submitted two documents to the SCM committee on the role of subsidies in creating overcapacity. I'm not going to give you the technical references, but you can find those documents at the back of the room, the two documents that we submitted, one in October 2016, which was a more general introduction, and then the second paper in April of 2017, where we came up with some specific answers. The purpose of today's seminar is to have our experts address the relationship between subsidies and overcapacity from different angles, thereby deepening the debate about the issue, and is also part of a broader discussion on the role of subsidies in trade. These issues are very, very prominent right now in this organization with regard to fisheries, and there's also a lot of talk in this town on the relationship between subsidies and climate change. We intend to provide a debriefing to the SCM committee on the 24th of October of this year, a debriefing of this seminar to that committee. In our paper of April 2017, we argue that subsidies that contribute to overcapacity must be considered for more stringent disciplines than those that are currently existing in the ASCM. And we hope, of course, that this seminar will help us in the discussion to take further steps. With those introductory words, I now hand over to Gary to commence block 1 of today's seminar. Gary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You didn't come here to hear me, so I'm going to very quickly go through the meeting arrangements. The speakers have divided up the time among themselves. You will see me reach out and grab them if they exceed them. That's because we want a robust discussion among you. There's plenty of expertise in the room, and in addition, you're the people who have to deal with this. So please think about comments you might want to make, questions you might want to ask, and so on. There will be time for it. There is no break, so be my guest, feel free, leave whenever you feel like it, go outside to talk, whatever. We'll do the same for the panelists. You're not actual prisoners here yet. So my only further comment is, the one comment I don't want to hear is that's not permitted under the agreement. The purpose here is to start thinking about how the current agreement can be interpreted, but also what changes, which requires consensus, of course, might possibly be needed. The subsidies agreement, like many of the others, was last looked at seriously in 1993. That's a long time ago. So without further ado, we will kick this off. I will start with Karl Tachelet. Karl, over to you. I'm skipping long introductions. The speakers can introduce themselves as they think fit.
Thank you, Gary. My name is Karl Tachelet. I'm a Director of International Affairs in the European Steel Association, Eurofer, based in Brussels. I would like to go into the situation of excess capacity as it has evolved in the steel industry, and particularly what are the mechanisms who have been driving this situation. Second, I would like to look a bit more closer into the notion of excess capacity. Is excess capacity uniquely defined, or are there different ways to look at? And here I will make the link with subsidies. So in our sector, again, the discussions are dominated by the plague of excess capacity, and that's not new. We had crises before. But in the past, these crises were mainly contained regionally. The novelty of the steel crisis today is its truly global reach. But it does have a center, and that center is China. Now, how serious is steel capacity today? How serious is the problem? The OECD estimates global steel capacity at around 2.4 billion tons, which is more than what capacity was in 2000. The production is 1.7 billion tons, so there is a gap of around 700 million tons. Critically, utilization rate is around 70%, and this is not sustainable for a high fixed cost industry like steel. We would need at least 80%. So excess capacity is basically a problem of structural underutilization of existing capacities. And given high fixed costs, which need to be covered, companies tend to produce additional volumes, additional tonnages, which cannot always be sold unless at a lower price. So ultimately, by depressing steel prices domestically and internationally, global excess production destroys capital and value in our sector. Steel is a margin industry. Here I would like to make a link with an element which I think is as critical in addressing excess capacity as is the question of subsidies and government support measures. That is the fragmentation of our industry and the need for consolidation. Individual companies want to have their own blast furnace, their own electrical arc furnace, they want their own hot rolling mill, coating lines, so you have a trend of capacity duplication. And this trend creates hyper competition, which however not necessarily reflects genuine cost advantage. So therefore, creation of bigger steel groups allows optimization of capacity utilization and, very importantly, improves flexibility in managing the high fixed cost capacities. And this is critical for our sector in light of the high concentration our sector is facing at the supply side, particularly the miners. Now, the steel crisis of 2015. The Chinese steel capacity exploded since 2004 on the back of double-digit steel demand growth, and this growth was fueled by massive infrastructure, construction, and industry investments. So the Chinese steel capacity reached 1.2 billion tons in 2016, which is an increase of 60%, up from 720 million tons in 2009. And now to put this in context, China's steel capacity is now half worldwide capacity. The steel capacity of the EU, which is after China the biggest steel market and industry, is only 220 million tons. Now in 2014, Chinese steel demand turned abruptly negative, exposing the massive size of its capacity. Excess capacity can be measured at 300 million tons against what it produces, and 400 million tons measured against its consumption. As a consequence, Chinese steel exports reached more than 100 million tons in 2015, which is a massive volume, double what it exported in 2012. Now, China says that its export levels, around 10 to 12% of its production, have remained at a normal level, and in fact even lower than other major steel markets. 18% in 2016 EU and 35% Japan. Now these numbers are correct, but this presentation of what China considers a normal situation covers up reality. First, of course, 12% of 810 million tons produced in China is not the same as exports of 18% of 165 million tons produced in the EU. Second, the Chinese export surge in 2015 was sudden. Export jumped from 60 million tons in 2013 up to 92 million tons in 2014 to reach the 110 million tons in 2015, an exponential increase of 85%. In a context of global steel demand remaining flat between 2013 and 2015. And third, Chinese excess production was sold at irrational pricing, not only destroying its own domestic market but also their export markets. Now the Chinese, with regard to EU, which has been particularly vulnerable to the Chinese exports, the Chinese finished steel imports in the EU surged from 2.5 million tons in 2013 to 7 million tons in 2015. So 1 out of 3 tons imported in the EU came from China. Now, 2015 Chinese domestic hot rolled coil price collapsed by 40%. Chinese export prices by 35%, with a knock-on effect on EU domestic prices, who collapsed by 30%. End of 2015, China exported hot rolled coil at 250 euros per ton and even lower. This is a price level not even covering variable costs, forcing other exporters to the EU to push down their prices and margins. So China as well as EU producers, we were losing billions. The actual dimension of excess capacity is such that according to the OECD prognose, global steel demand in 2035 would still remain below the steelmaking capacity in 2017, 500 million tons. So who needs more steel? Now India says I do, as well as Indonesia and Vietnam, Algeria, Middle East economies. And here I would send out some critical questions. Why would a country like India, with the lowest steel consumption per capita among the major emerging economies, forgo the development of its own domestic steel industry? To supply the steel, its infrastructure, its construction and industrial development will need. why depending on imported steel produced in foreign economies instead of producing it domestically, securing jobs, skills, and an industrial value chain? In particular, when you have the raw materials, including iron ore and coal. India has important, rich iron ore reserves. Europe has to import these raw materials. And then it becomes a bit more tricky. Why not supporting development of my steel industry with subsidies, with market and trade policies aimed at replacing imports with domestic production? And then ultimately, why not turning net imports into net exports, in particular when raw materials are available, securing a genuine cost competitive advantage? India plans to increase its capacity to 250 million tons, up from the current level of 120 tons today, to meet expected demand growth. Worldwide, planned additional capacities can be estimated at around 350 million tons. The point I want to make here is that the situation of massive global excess capacity is an aggregation. It's an analysis on paper. Capacities, production and demand are driven regionally, often reflecting legitimate concerns and objectives. However, given the already existing massive excess capacity and the very low return on investment, the goal of self-sufficiency in steelmaking capacity will have an opportunity cost, likely to be much higher than if these economies would source steel through trade. Now, nobody, including China, questions the need for major structural capacity, rebalancing the Chinese steel industry. What about other two major net exporters? For example, Russia and Japan, respectively net exporting 27 and 35 million tons. Are these countries part of the global steel excess capacity, depressing the performance of our industry? Let me go to the notion of excess capacity. There is not one size fits all definition of excess capacity. First, to quantify and monitor excess capacity usefully, a distinction needs to be made between capacity increase and capacity closure to come to net capacity. Now, this is obvious, but critical for China, where ongoing capacity adjustment focuses on replacing and upgrading existing capacities to improve the overall economic and environmental performance of its steel industry. Now, second, capacity can be measured against production or domestic demand. For 2016, excess capacity in Japan can be estimated at a level of 60 million tons compared with domestic demand. But only, between brackets, only 25 million tons compared with what it produces. A similar situation you have in Russia. In contrast, US steel capacity is fairly imbalanced with demand, but demand, or capacities rather, was more than 30 million tons above its production, turning or making the US a major traditional net importer of steel. So the difference between both calculation of excess capacities versus production versus demand is a trade. Now, measuring national or regional capacity against domestic demand exposes export capacity. Now, measuring capacity against production covers up the importance of production for exports. Third, excess capacities can be, or capacity can be of a cyclical or structural nature. It is another way of looking at excess capacities, looking at the time horizon. Excess capacity can be of a cyclical and structural nature. Take the EU. In the global financial crisis of 2008, we lost 70 million tons of of steel demand. Demand collapsed from a peak of 200 million tons in 2008 down to 130 million tons. 8 years later, we have still not recovered. Today, EU steel demand stands at 160 million tons. Accordingly, the European steel industry had to adjust to a sudden demand shock, cyclical, that had created a structural imbalance in our sector adjustments which led to a reduction in its own capacity of around 20 million tons since 2009. Cyclical overcapacity is caused by short-term changes in demand, variable demand, and regional demand shocks, as just illustrated looking to the situation of the EU, are common in our industry. They cause producers to export their way out as their capacities planned for the long term are inflexible. Capacities are not sensitive to price, and the barriers to exit the market are very high. We had the situations also in the 1990s with the Russian implosion, the Russian economy implosion, and in 1998 with the Asian financial crisis. The structural overcapacity refers to the situation of overinvestment over time. And basically you have overinvestment if capacities are planned and built, supported by government policies and measures beyond what a market price and return analysis would justify. Structural excess capacity is the additional capacity, fundamentally, which a functioning market does not require. Contributing to this mechanism are overly optimistic mid- and long-term demand scenarios. Now, forms of subsidies and all government support measures, and my colleagues will for sure further develop this in detail. You have the direct financial support, preferential loans, credit, direct cash grants, equity infusions, tax, use of land, preferential access raw materials, and so on. Let me finish with one comment on the question of addressing excess capacity. Trade actions tackle the trade distorting and market disrupting effects of the regional capacity imbalances. These actions, and there are many in our sector, do not address the root causes of the problem. There is a universal recognition that capacity subsidy and state support contribute to steel excess capacities. And established in the wake of the 2015 steel crisis, the G20 Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity, comprising all major steel regions in the world, is a unique sectoral platform. And it has an ambitious agenda to develop concrete policy solutions that reduce steel excess capacity globally. Concretely, the members are exchanging detailed capacity data, even at plant level, as well as information on capacity-related policies, notably capacity reduction targets, limitation, respectively, targets on capacity additions, facilitation of capacity closures, and more generally, capacity support measures. So with this, I end my reflection, and I refer to the specifics on subsidies, which will be presented by my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karl, and for completing it in less than your allotted time. Markus?
Okay.
You're on.
Yeah, I'm fine. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm just wondering, how can I put on the slides? Here we are.
This should work.
Okay. Okay. Marc, are you going to bring up my slide?
This?
Use the moment. So very nice to see you. Excellent introduction. Good.
So, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. A little bit of a hiccup there. I'm going to tell you a pretty much similar story to the one Karl Tachelet was telling you just a few minutes ago on steel. This one is about aluminium. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Duisburg-Essen, so please, I'm not one of the lawyers here in the room. I'm coming from a different universe. Please keep this in mind. I would like to make a couple of points here. First of all, I think we should consider the topic of subsidies along the whole value chain. Not just one industry, but we must look at the whole value chain, And we should also look at sustainability issues, which I think are becoming more and more important. This is what I've prepared for today. Just to give you a guideline, I will start with a few words on the aluminum industry. What you're seeing here is a picture of a very dynamically developing industry, dramatic increases in volume and production capacity, and you see also that this increase is primarily coming from China. So while the rest of the world is more stagnating in build-up of capacity and its production, we see China taking over larger and larger shares of the global system. By now we are beyond 50% of the global market, way beyond 50% in terms of capacity. Looking at this, so we see we have a growing market, then we at the same time observe a rather strange phenomenon. You see here, this is the rest of the world production that's stable. We do see that Chinese production is going up dramatically. So what's about prices? All the economists here in the room will agree, I guess, that it's quite strange to see prices dropping instead of increasing. So if prices are dropping by 30-40% the last couple of years, then there must be something wrong with the market mechanisms or with the mechanisms which are guiding the markets in this sector. The point here is it's overcapacities which have been induced by subsidies. Let me introduce first a few theoretical analytical concepts. Let's have a look at the idea of comparative advantages first. So, we are here at WTO, so this is something you're having for breakfast every single day. So comparative markets is what we're actually looking for, what we're striving for to be implemented in the global system. Their real cost advantages are driving the division of labor in the global system. My point here is that this is not what we're observing in the aluminum industry in the global system. We should see something where comparative cost advantages are revealing themselves really according to market-based price structures, and in the best of all worlds, in a world where natural resources, the using up of nature is priced into the cost calculus. This is obviously not the case. For example, we have Europe having much lower carbon intensity than China, still a massive importer of aluminum. Look at Canada, which has probably the cheapest electricity supply or the most clean energy supply in the global system, also not being represented in its true strength in this import-export perspective. Now, and here I'm following up on what Tachelet was raising there, the notion of overshooting capacity versus overcapacity. So overshooting capacity is what market economists like to see, because overshooting capacity is something we want to have in functioning dynamic market economies which are developing, which bring in new entrepreneurs, new processes, new technological management innovations. So they are an indicator of functioning market competition. They challenge incumbents in the existing market, drive dynamic market development by introducing higher productivity, better resource utilization, better being able to meet demand changes of the existing customer structure. How does it work? Well, temporarily overshooting capacities exist for short periods of time only. They arise and disappear in a fluctuating pattern, driven by entrepreneurial creativity, and this is the most important point here, they are subjected to a strict profit-loss calculus. If you're not profitable after a couple of the specific period of time, then you must leave the market. And that's the idea. You create excess, or you create overshooting capacity, but this is taken out of the market after a certain period of time once some of these players have proven themselves to be no longer able to meet the demands of the market in a profitable or cost-covering manner. Now, overcapacity is a little bit different. And that's an important point why we must differentiate between overshooting capacity, which is something we want to see, and overcapacity, which is something we don't want to see. Overcapacities constitute structural long-term discrepancies between the capacity, which is installed, and the actual production. They are facilitated by state business collusion and manipulated markets. And of course, they can persist only if market mechanisms are put out of force. So they must be covered by soft budget constraints and are not subjected to strict profit loss calculations. If that would be the case, if you would have no soft budget constraints, if profit loss calculus would be implemented, then these overcapacities would leave the market, but they don't. So there must be some non-market element in there. So persistent overcapacities undermine the competitive process and industry evolution insofar as new market entries are being blocked by the incumbents. Industry and society as a whole are suffering because we have static inefficiencies and dynamic inefficiencies as well. The markets do not evolve as they should be. We have a lack of innovation. So, having said that, we must take a look at what's going on in the Chinese aluminum industry. I've just shown you in the first slide that the build-up of capacity of production in the global system is coming from China. And what do we see in China? Well, we do not only see a massive build-up of production and demand in China, but at the same time we also see massive overcapacity. So while we see a positive development, we see one which is over the top. We do see rising, persisting overcapacity in China. It's not that we have persistent overcapacity, but the stock of overcapacity is becoming larger and larger. So there must be a structural weakness in the system. There must be something wrong. And we do not only see this in the primary sector, we also see it in the semi-sector, in the processed aluminum sectors down the value chain. So overcapacity is not just restricted to the primary sector. It is not really a surprise that we have this huge production build-up in China. We see this massive overcapacity, that we also see a rise of exports. This is what we are seeing. We see that China is building up overcapacity, and this overcapacity is trying to find a vent. It's trying to find a market. And obviously the easiest way to find that after we have satisfied domestic demand is to look to the rest of the world, and that is manifesting itself in massive exports in primary and especially in semi further processed stages of aluminum products. Now, the thing is, if we would be able to establish a case where we do have comparative advantages for China, because cost structures in China would be beneficial for such an industry, then that would be fine and we wouldn't be sitting here. But the point is, and that's the case I would like to make here today, that this buildup of capacity which we find in China is not a natural outcome of market forces, but is rather triggered by massive governmental interventions. I personally would classify these governmental interventions into six categories. We do have massive ambiguous state-business relations, where the borderline between regulator and regulated is completely blurred. So we have Communist Party, we have a government, and we have company leaders, business managers. Well, the thing is, the borderlines between them are blurred, and people usually wear more than one hat at the same time. If you look at recent developments in China, then we see once again a massive strengthening of the role and the influence of the Communist Party on managerial decisions in the companies. We see that people move in and out of management and government positions, etc., etc. So it's blurred, and we have here a situation where people are wearing 2 or 3 hats at the same time. We do have soft budget constraints by non-market-based policy loans, and recently we have a massive wave of debt equity swaps. I will come back to that in a minute to give you some numbers there. What we do find is politically distorted input prices. I just mentioned that already. Aluminum is extremely energy intensive. So primary aluminum more or less is a storage of energy. So what we have in terms of energy prices is very, very important for the final pricing of the product. So massive subsidization of steel coal, for example, which is a primary material to produce electricity, which is then feeding into the aluminum production, is a key subsidization of the aluminum industry. We do see this in very substantial terms here. More than 90% of the Chinese steel industry is owned by the government, as government states officially, and we see massive subsidization of the coal industry. We do have a steering of domestic sales prices. I will come back to that as well. We have a very specific China pricing mechanism, which is taken out of the global pricing system, actually. We have a very proactively managed interface to the global market system. We have export-import taxes, VAT rebate systems. We have a very specific fake semi-handling. We have a national champions policy, which is actually also feeding into the production of semis, which are then exported to the global markets. And we do have an extensive system of subsidies. On each of these topics, we could probably talk the whole day. I will just restrict myself on a few points here. What I've got here is just, and I will just show you the slideshow, all these are subsidies which we have been able to verify for the aluminum industry. So these are programs by which subsidies are handed out to individual companies in the sector. The volume of what is being handed out is in this range. Here you find on the left-hand side for 4 companies subsidies in renminbi, in yuan renminbi, and in the left-hand column you find the subsidies in net income before taxes. A positive number, you see it here for Aluminum Corp of China 2015. Here subsidies are 200% of net income before taxes. So double the net income has been received by this company in terms of subsidies. If the company is not showing a profit, then you see here these negative percentages. These are simply showing how much subsidies have contributed in reducing the losses eventually cleared by this company. So you see, we are not talking about peanuts here. We are talking about very substantial numbers. We are talking about subsidies in a volume which are certainly making an impact on the international competitiveness of these companies in the global system. I'll jump over that. This is actually something we've done for the whole non-ferrous metals industry, of which aluminum is, of course, a major part. And you see here, just looking at the 65 major companies, we come over the whole sector to a situation where net income before tax, well, 27% of that is based on subsidy income in the Chinese market. And if we look at profit after tax, then more than 50% of that is actually subsidy income. Yeah? So the point I want to make here is really, this is not level playing field. We are really seeing substantial governmental grants and promotional activities feeding into the sector. If we look at the interface to the global market, well, once again, this remains under firm governmental control. We have export taxes, VAT rebates, which are sometimes changed a couple of times during the year, just according to market demand, etc. We have a restrictive inward-outward, discriminatory inward-outward FDI regime, etc., etc. I'm not going into details now. This is that equity swaps thing, which I wanted to talk about shortly. The thing is, we have here now a situation where the Chinese government is buying out debt from companies and exchanging that for equity. This is a new program implemented since about 3/4 of a year, and this period 710 billion renminbi have been allocated. Out of these, 50% has been going to the coal industry. As I mentioned before, the coal industry is a main supplier of energy to the aluminum industry. So we see here more than 350 billion renminbi going into that industry, which is supplying coal, steam coal energy to the aluminum sector, depressing that input price and making it possible for the industry to expand capacities and charge lower prices than they would have to in a regular market environment. We have, as a result, a capacity utilization in the primary sector in China of about 75% right now. If we go into the semi-sector, we have capacity utilization of about 70%, very much in line with what we have seen in the steel industry. This is not compatible with the requirements of functioning industries and business. The Chinese pricing sector, as I mentioned before, is separated from the global sector. We have a Shanghai price and the global price, which is determined in London. What we now see is that in Shanghai, or the Chinese market, we have overall subsidization, which is depressing the cost-covering prices in the sector, and we have high overcapacities, which are persistent structurally in the market. So this oversupply is also depressing prices because we have this excessive supply of aluminum. All this results in a depressed price level in Shanghai, and this is then traveling to the global prices. We have a larger price differential between these two marketplaces. This incentivizes companies, players to arbitrage. So we have exports from China into the global market. The global market is subjected to an exogenous shock by Chinese exports into the global market, which is increasing the supply in the ex-China global market, which of course is then depressing the prices in the ex-China global markets. So depressed prices in China are traveling directly to the global pricing system, and companies in the US, in Europe, are facing a supply-demand structure which is not adhering to the real fundamentals of market competitiveness and productivity and strength of these companies. As a result, we do see that EU primary production has been going down substantially in recent years, while at the same time EU imports have risen dramatically. So we understand this as a direct consequence of the mechanisms I have been trying to outline these recent minutes. We can move on in discussing the implications. We talk about national supply structures, which might be sensitive. Our American colleagues might have to say something about that. The dependence on external suppliers, the question how far, for example, self-sufficiency for military applications is given, or if especially these players are driven out of the market, etc., etc. So this is not only an issue of market discipline, but also a matter of national security. And finally, to make this point again, markets, if they do price nature into their cost calculus, are the best mechanism we have in order to implement sustainability. If this is not the case, then our drive for ecological sustainability, for long-term development, social development, is undermined and does not work. I mentioned already the case of Canada. I mentioned the case of the European Union already. What you're seeing here, this is Europe, a much lower CHG emissions per ton of aluminum, but these players are actually driven out by the Chinese players who are featuring a much worse ecological constellation there. So, what is the conclusion? Persistent overcapacities are undermining the basic functioning principles of the world's competition-based market order. We must look at the whole value chain, because it's over the whole value chain that these subsidies are being disbursed and eventually feed into the aluminum industry, and the same counts, of course, for the steel industry as well. We do find shock waves of distorted prices, where we have an inefficient allocation of resources and goods. We have a crowding out of the better firms. We have reduced development dynamics. In China, we have, especially with these forced M&A patterns we are observing in the last 2 or 3 years again, artificial economies of scale and scope, non-functioning market exit, discriminatory access to artificial cheap inputs over the whole value chain. Asset allocation is decoupled from corporate performance, unfair path dependencies, and eventually, and that's the important point, I started with the comparative advantages, I end here with the comparative advantages. Comparative advantages are being distorted. We do have an unsustainable, wrong allocation of resources and a wrong selection of market participants. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're now open for discussion. I don't see that many timid people out in front of me. You all have points of view, I'm sure, so please, we don't have the usual flag, so just wave your hand, I guess. Someone? And I also invite the panelists, of course, to comment. I guess it's not a very interesting topic. Jean?
How do you do? I'm Jean Kemp from the United States. I wanted to ask Dr. Taube about the impact of the speak up? Okay. About the impact of the excess capacity shift that you noted in your presentation from Chinese exports onto global markets, affecting not only the Shanghai price but also the LME price. Our understanding is that China imposes export taxes on primary aluminum, limiting the volumes of primary aluminum exported to the global market. How then is this effect transferred onto global markets, such as the LME London-based price for primary aluminum? Thank you.
Is the sound system working? Could everyone hear that? Okay, good.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. A very good question. China is of course a very smart player in the market, and they know that primary aluminum is a storage of energy, and this is something they don't want to give out of the market at face value. So what we are seeing actually is a move, a politically orchestrated move towards higher processing stages. So the government is actually trying to transfer the bulk of exports towards higher processing stages, so that we move into semis and even higher stages of processing, and that the impact is actually then happening over semis and other products. But on top of that, we have what is called fake semis, which is simply wrong labeling of primary, which is processed into products which are then exported under a different HS signature, then in the destination market remelted and becomes primary again. So this is something we have been observing very intensively in recent years in various instances, and we are talking about hundreds of very substantial numbers of fake semis which have been exported. For example, in the Mexican market, where it was destined to be moved on to the Northern American markets, which eventually didn't happen because that was detected, and we have other instances as well.
Do you have any quantification of that?
Yeah, I think we have for the Mexican market, we have about 800,000 K metric tons, if I'm not mistaken. I would have to check right now the thing.
So if I could just follow up, and Gene, I think, has heard this answer from me before. But anyway, so I think if you look at the LME pricing and the Shanghai pricing, you will find that they are extremely highly correlated. They move in tandem with one another. What the LME is primarily reflecting is the total amount of global supply of aluminum, regardless of location. There are LME warehouses in China, there are LME warehouses in Rotterdam, in the United States, everywhere, and it is reflecting the total amount of global supply. So you don't have to have direct exports from China of primary aluminum to affect aluminum pricing, because that's the nature of having a global commodity exchange. It is reflecting the total amount of global supply. And to your question, Gary, about the fake semis, just read the Wall Street Journal article about the $1.5 billion of aluminum pallets that were exported to the U.S. that weren't actually aluminum pallets.
The 850 K tons to Mexico, that's the right number. Yeah. So it's very, very substantial what we're talking about here.
Questions, comments? People on the margins are invited to comment as well. Other panelists? I'll ask questions, so to get you started. You mentioned the impact on climate change. So the EU has an emissions trading system, and some of the other countries, notably large countries, notably the US and China, do not. Japan does, I think, yes. Does that have an effect on some of the capacity issues you're discussing?
Well, the thing is that China is right now experimenting with these kind of emission trading systems, and as far as I know, only one of these pilot mechanisms is working more or less, and that is located in an area where we have very little aluminum capacity. So right now, this is not having an impact of what's going on in China.
But in the other countries?
Yeah. Karl.
Yeah, picking up this question for steel, and of course, first looking to our own European steel. The EU ETS system is a system which is and will impact directly the future shape of and size, performance of European steel capacities, for sure. Simply because its purpose is to inject a price, a cost related to your emission performance. Of course, steel, like some other sectors, are under intense international competition through trade. And this in particular in a steel sector where you have this global excess capacity. The question or the response, how to address what is called carbon leakage, is going to be critical and will impact the future capacity picture. In the first stage, the EU ETS has recognized that a sector like steel is under intense international competition, therefore there is a risk of carbon leakage, basically meaning that at some point Europe risks to close capacities while other capacities can further develop and export, not under the same emission constraints and cost constraints. So the carbon leakage is clearly there, has been recognized. Now, there are basically two ways to address this. One is to make an exemption for the steel capacities, the European steel capacities, not to pay an emission right, which is on the market, and where the price can be influenced by by reducing the available amount, by creating a shortage. So to get free allowances, as it is called. Problem with this is that the price signal is neutralized, and capacities could continue to operate and even to develop business as usual. The other aspect is where you look for an adjustment at the border. So this is a discussion which was into the EU ETS, and which from our sector we have been advocating for free allowances. The EU ETS now is under revision, and depending on the outcome of the revision, we may have to see a situation where the system would start to become really expensive for the operation of our capacities. Improvements of emissions, investment to improve these emissions are underway, but there are physical limits. So at some point we may be confronted with a cost impact which under carbon leakage may be neutralized to some extent by a border measure. Who knows, but would definitely change and have an impact on the size and the operation of our capacities in Europe.
And the border measure.
Well, trading system is just one modality. This is a question where the authority, of course, will have to design its regime. The WTO is a framework which will have to be looked at. Of course, I think personally that if the EU is going to decide as a policy choice to increase the cost of emissions, which have to be work into the operation of our industry, that some regime may be developed, looking to the flow of imports, looking or the source of the imports, looking to the way the exporting industries to the EU are developing their capacities, to what extent they reflect market conditions or not. So that is going to be, of course, a critical analysis, which we may see in the future, but again, depending on the outcome of the revision of EU ETS, which is ongoing.
The very pricey consultancies, which for a large sum will give you plant-by-plant analyses. I'm sure you may have seen some of those. Do those match up with these numbers at all?
I mean, this slide which I was showing here, the slide I've been showing here has, of course, has a very high granularity, and is, of course, just an average. It's too coarse, actually. But the point is that if you look into the cost advantages and the productivity of these Chinese players, most of them are, well, the bulk does not fare better. Actually, fares worse than what we see in Europe, for example. I'm not talking about the United States.
No, and just to follow up, Gary, I actually have gone through all of those, and yes, the overwhelming amount of Chinese production facility by facility are far above cost, far above the global average. And frankly, for those facilities that are not, or at, or close to, or slightly below, as I'll get into my presentation, there are specific subsidies that they've received that allow them to move down that cost chain to make that happen.
Once again, to add on that, I mean, I've been pushing this notion of looking at the full value chain. This is something we really have to do, and also these consultancies must do actually much more than they actually do. Look at the full value chain. Where do you have subsidies in the companies which are providing the input to these aluminum players? And this is changing the picture actually, and makes it worse actually.
Aluminium's actually relatively, everyone will jump on me for this, relatively simple product. So, compared even to steel. So you have bauxite, you have electricity, you have capital costs. That's pretty much it. And so the electricity component, which you showed in one of the charts, is quite a large piece of the difference between, say, on the environmental side between China and Europe. But that's upstream from the aluminum producer.
Actually, it's not. So, in China, what they have been doing is providing subsidies to take a lot of that electricity production in-house so that it's a cogeneration facility. And as Markus was showing in one of his other slides, that goes all the way up the chain to the coal facility as well. So you'll have the coal company owns a power facility, owns a primary aluminum smelting facility, and it's all linked in one chain. And for some of these Chinese producers, especially the ones that have located out west, the government just provides them coal mines to go along with it. So the entire value chain is covered.
What about...
May I add one sentence on that? Because right now we see this national champion policy, which is moving this also the other way, down the value chain. You have these national champions, these aluminum industrial city parks, which are being created, where companies are more or less forced to move into the processing stages. So you have a very, very large share of liquid aluminum which is sold or which is distributed in China, and that is feeding directly into these processing plants. So what we are seeing here is a state-directed impulse for hugely integrated plants, which are covering areas where in our Western understandings we would have a chain of, let's say, 10 to 20 companies. Yeah, it's all integrated in China and all covered and controlled by government agencies.
Somewhat playing devil's advocate, perhaps. So has that been the case in other countries at similar stages of development of an aluminum industry?
So I think if you look at, going back to Markus's point, the development curve, in aluminum is developed where you have cheap, low-cost, clean energy. So the Middle East would be an example where you've had recent capacity expansions, or relatively recent, along with the Chinese. But the electricity cost to generate the electricity used in that production is extremely low cost, and it makes sense to build those facilities where they were built. It makes no sense at all to build primary aluminum facilities in China, which is by far and away the highest cost producer of any country in the world, and yet over this period of time, they go from essentially 20% of global capacity to 56%, and are by far and away the highest cost producer and using the dirtiest input to generate the electricity. So you have a very different development curve with aluminum as it was.
And that's not true in any other country?
No.
My image for a lot of countries is hydroelectric supply. Is that image still true?
Right, so you'll have most of the Canadian production is hydro, a large portion of Russian production is hydro, U.S. production is principally hydro, and U.S. Electricity costs have come down significantly with the fracking revolution to the point where U.S. production costs are competitive. European production is mostly hydro, and that is not the case in China. It is nearly 100% coal-based.
please.
Thank you, and thank you indeed to both speakers for their illuminating presentations. I'm Stephen Amalsingh from the EU mission to the WTO. A question specifically to Mr. Taube, if I may, and in asking it I will probably reveal that I'm not an economist but rather a lawyer. You had one slide in which you were listing 6 groups of subsidies and functional equivalents to subsidies. I was just wondering, in an ideal world and without jumping the gun on the next session, if you, from an economics perspective, could point to perhaps 2 or 3 categories out of the 6 which in your view are the most pernicious or economically important and would therefore perhaps warrant prioritization in terms of addressing it in the context of the WTO. Thank you.
Well, you're raising here. This is a very, very tricky question you're raising there. You're bringing this up, great. Thank you very much. It's slides. I can't read it. Can you go down, please? Yeah. Mark? Further down, further down. Here we are, that one. Yeah. In my understanding, what makes the Chinese economic system so special and makes it so difficult for us to deal with it and deal with it also in trade question is the first point, is the state-business nexus we find in China, which is neither standard centrally planned economy nor market economy. It's a hybrid. It's something in between, and it's something against we have not really found an antidote, or which we very often do not really understand what's going on there. This fuzzy delineation between regulator and regulated. I think this is at the core of the problem, or at the core of the friction we have here. And then I think the key is distorted prices. Distorted prices is what we are finding at all of these stages. If you look at 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, this is all about prices being distorted by various means. And all this is resulting from a normative approach by certain government agencies who try to design the market, or to design the market outcome according to some normative ideals and goals. So it's, in my understanding, a conscious endeavor to design market outcomes, and that's a problem. If you want me to pick one out of these,
Even 2 and 3.
Yeah. Okay. I think 3 politically distorted input prices, because these start at the value chain and they feed through they travel through the whole value chain. Yeah? So these are prices which are being distorted at the very beginning of the value chains. We are talking about the cost of capital, we are talking about the cost of raw materials, we are talking about land use rights. Yeah? And these distortions, they travel through the whole value chain and end up in completely distorted end market prices, and product prices.
I have an unfair question for you that perhaps some of the others might want to take on. There was, and this is steel, not aluminium, there was a draft international agreement on steel subsidies through OECD in 2001, 2, which failed for various reasons. I'm not saying it was a perfect agreement either.
Yeah.
So if that had been in effect, so this is totally unfair because none of us have the text in front of us.
Yeah.
How much of that would have been affected? That's my first question, not to you, to everyone or anyone who remembers it. Secondly, still in my devil's advocate role, in my experience, most government giving subsidies expect something in return. Not always explicit, not usually explicit. That can take many forms, some more illicit than others. But what sorts of things do if you're a Chinese aluminum company getting all of that?
Okay.
What are you meant to do in return?
So let me start.
You start.
Just to answer the other question, the earlier question, I think in my presentation, you'll see it's principally two types of subsidies, and obviously financial lending, capital infusions, the old adage, follow the money, and what the lawyers would call LTARs, inputs for less than adequate remuneration, which is what you were talking about. But Gary, to go to your question, as an example, there has been an enormous amount of new investment in the far western provinces in China. There is no reason to build primary aluminum production facilities in those provinces. It is very far from where all of the semi-finished production takes place. A large amount of the bauxite has to be imported into the eastern part of the country and shipped very far distances into the west to then be processed into primary aluminum and shipped back out. At the time they were constructing these facilities, there was one rail line, and only one rail line, in and out of that province. The reason for building those facilities out there, the Chinese would say, well, we have all these coal facilities out there, so the inputs will be cheaper, and that's true if I give you the coal mine. But there is also this effort to move a lot of the Han population west, and there are non-economic reasons for wanting to move economic production into that region of the country. And so that, when you asked about that quid pro quo, that's an example.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think the first part of the question, I think this is something for Karl, huh? You have some answer to that? The second one, what does the Chinese government get out of that for providing subsidies? I mean, this is
in between. Is it the central government or the provincial government?
This is a point. This is a point I want to make because once again we are falling into this trap of using our categories in trying to analyze what's going on in China. Look at this very first point there: ambiguous state-business relationships and people wearing a multitude of hats. This is the thing I think we in the Western world are really do have difficulties in understanding. We are thinking in a world where we have regulators and we have regulated, and they are not really always on friendly terms. Yeah, it's a kind of co-opetition system which is in circles and spirals moving upwards towards higher welfare, etc. We do not have this in China. Yeah, we have a much more collusive atmosphere where the political leadership or the political elite and the business elite is more or less the same people. So it's not about I do something for you, you do something for me. It's not this classical tit for tat we have here. Here we've got one elite which is striving for the same goals, and these goals are eventually China, number one, make China more powerful, increase the welfare of our nation. Yeah? As you see, if we talk about soft budget constraints, if we talk about what's going on right now with these debt equity swaps, we are not talking about individual business profits or that a certain company is providing a special goodies to the locality. No, we are talking about national efforts. We are talking about much larger categories here.
Anyone care to, please?
Yeah, I would like to pick up the first part of the question, Gary, on steel. This was in the 2001, 2002, and it was in a situation which is very similar to the situation today. We had a steel crisis, which in particular hit very severely the US steel industry. And it was about the OECD, as it is doing still today, looking into excess capacity, but with a mandate going beyond that and discussing subsidy discipline specifically for our sector. And I remember following this discussion, the discussions that the ambition was to set a framework of rules ultimately to inject into the WTO as a sectoral subsidy agreement. Unfortunately, looking back now, this happened before China came on the international scene, developing its capacities and its exports. Unfortunately, because there was an opportunity to develop a template, a discipline, which would set a framework and which allow, in particular for the EU and the US, to have leverage in with regard to China. What happened there is that, in fact, those days steel was basically a discussion between the EU and the US. So there was not this global view where the upcoming emerging economies developing their steel industry and in the center of this China. So we were discussing about aspects which today would look like of minor importance facing the problem of excess capacities, which was on the one hand an absolute prohibition of subsidies and support measures related to capacities, but then the whole discussion, which finally led to a break of the talks, was whether the EU was allowed to have specific exemptions on subsidies in relation to R&D, social and restructuring. So in conclusion, whether it would have, let's say, influenced the situation as we have seen today is difficult, but for sure it would have given a template for the EU and US today.
For completeness, please, Marc.
Gary, just to add one more thought. I think Karl is right that had that agreement moved forward, there would at least be an existing structure by which to operate. Nevertheless, as I think you'll hear from the presentations in the next panel, much of this would have turned on how you define subsidies and which ones are elicited specifically. And then to tie this to the other part of your question, certainly the Chinese economic structure has evolved in a way that was different than how most Americans and Europeans envisioned it to have evolved in the 2001-2002 timeframe. Much of that is a result of the economic restructurings that happened in the early to mid-2000s. That agreement, even if it had come into place, would not have addressed those elements. So I think we would still have a set of lingering problems today as well.
Jean?
Thank you, Gary. With regard to the steel subsidy agreement talks that were begun in 2001, and they actually proceeded until about 2005, first of all, I'd just like to note that it was a framework for the prohibition of most subsidies, and there was disagreement on potential exemptions, but that it wasn't just the EU's potential exemptions. There were, exemptions for certain subsidies under the state aids code, but there was also requests for exemptions for India and for Egypt, and China was participating in the discussion, was basically saying that none of it really applied to them. So there were many different kinds of exemptions being discussed, and also the nature of certain definitions was, and whether they go on above and beyond WTO definitions was also a point of contention. That agreement is still extant somewhere. It didn't come into place, but we still have the text. The OECD still has the text, and could be informative. Obviously, that took a very long time and did not yield an actual agreement. So I think the OECD and Global Forum, that is the process that's going on now, is trying to make more of a political commitment rather than a legalistic type of commitment initially, and then to see if you can build from that in the future. Thank you.
For completeness, sorry, please.
Hello. My name is Sonia Mourabit. I represent the European aluminium industry. So I apologize because the discussion is moving towards the legal framework now, but I wanted to make two final points on the situation of the aluminium industry. So sorry to go back. My point was that the challenges faced by our companies, ironically, do not concern the fact that the aluminium industry is slowing down in its demand. It's a relatively healthy industry in the sense that we see a global growth in demand, 5 or 6%. So the problem is that we don't see that this materializes in a growth in market share for our companies. So they are under pressure at home, but also in terms of effects, they lose basically market shares in their export markets as well. So I just wanted to make that point that the effects are quite complex in nature as well. And then having said that, we're looking forward to the second part of the discussion, where we'll indeed discuss the legal framework, and it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on how certain, what we call state interferences, can be captured under the agreement, ones that are not, typical financial contribution, etc. So we're really looking forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for the intervention. Anyone else? It's 11:30. I declare the session over. It's the joy of being the chair. But since we're not taking breaks, I declare the session open. I think, Bernard, you're first. Is that correct? For completeness sake, I think, sorry. That was a very good point to raise.
Sorry?
That was a very good point to raise.
I'm thinking a lot about that.
Yeah,
because
no kidding.
I'm still in this sector, and I've been there also those days. And for me,
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to address you. My name is Bernard O'Connor, and I'm one of the lawyers. And I've done a fair bit of work in relation to steel. And as you will see, previously I've done a fair bit of work in relation to agriculture and subsidies. Steel is and manufactured goods are not the only things that we have subsidy issues with. My presentation, I would like to look first of all at what the OECD is doing, and asking whether the work of the OECD is sufficient. Then I'd like to look really at state-owned enterprises and what they are doing in specifically in China, but not only state-owned enterprises. I'd like to look a bit more at the wider benefits that there are for steel producers. And then finally, I would like to look at a couple of solutions that I think we could consider within the context of the WTO subsidies agreement. I take my starting point from the OECD, and the OECD tells us that in the steel sector, China is responsible for the vast majority of overcapacity. But I do really want to say too that overcapacity, as Karl Tachelet has been saying, is not merely a China problem. It is a wider problem, and we need to address it in that context. But today I am going to focus a bit more on China and try to give you some ideas of what is going on. How do I do this? I've tried to capture on a single slide the way in which steel production is organized in China. It is not a market-based organization. It is a very comprehensive system where we have As I've said here, we have the state council, but all the time animated by the Communist Party, and all sections and all activities within the state animated by the party. Now, at the top right-hand side of that slide, I've said all entities with more than 3 Communist Party members must create a committee. And that committee has a specific role, and that is to animate the company to act within the dictates of the party. And that committee must also then report back to the party as to what exactly has been achieved or not achieved within the context of what it is the party wants to achieve. We have therefore quite a difficult situation here in terms of our traditional approach to the rule of law in the OECD countries, and that is we have a state and various state actors, but we have a non-state actor. And capturing that for the purposes of disciplines is something that is not straightforward. Now, looking at steel, I think the first thing that we need to look at is the NDRC, because the NDRC is really one of the central bodies that determines the industrial policy. It sets out the 5-year plans, and these 5-year plans, I think it's important to understand that the 5-year plan is not just one single plan. We are now in the 13th period of 5-year planning, which is until 2020. But there were, under the last one, by the end of the 5-year plan period, 72 detailed 5-year plans. So in other words, we have the 5-year plan, a global economy-wide 5-year plan, but then we have very, very detailed industry by industry plans which go down into phenomenal detail as to what must be achieved within the period. The NDRC controls competition law. It controls investment, and all investment throughout the economy must get prior approval from the NDRC. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see the SASAC, which is the holding company for state-owned enterprises. I think if I was remaking this slide, I would probably put NDRC at the left-hand side, as it is probably the more important of the different agencies. For steel, we do concentrate quite a lot on state-owned enterprises, but we have to also understand that there is significant non-state-owned enterprises producing steel. What exactly non-state-owned enterprises are, we're not really too sure. There is some form of private capital, but there is also state capital, and there is also other products within, other ownership within it. The banking system. The banking system is controlled by the central hygiene, and here all banks belong to this, and so we have the main banking and financial institutions, again owned and controlled by the state, and having input into the achievement of the 5-year plans which are done and which are created by the NDRC. I should say that all of the 4 bodies that I've mentioned here, all of them have input into the creation of the plans. So I've created them as 4 pillars, but they are in fact very much interrelated. The most curious one, I think, is the China Iron and Steel Association, CHISA, at the right-hand side. Now, this is, if you like, the trade association. This is the Eurofer of China. But at the same time, it's really important to understand what its overall role is. It is the ex-Ministry of Steel. And and it is still peopled by the people who used to be ministry officials organising and controlling the steel sector. And even though now it is some form of an independent body, it still has the objective of coordinating steel production and steel prices within China. So within this overall system, I've tried to describe what it is that we're trying to capture when we look at overcapacity and we look at steel. Wrong way, sorry. Okay, now the OECD has started out to try and make a list, an inventory of subsidies in the steel sector. And here you can see this quite comprehensive list. The OECD has already prepared a paper and published a paper in which it shows what it is trying to do. But you can see here that it also goes as far as lax enforcement of regulation. And here, I think, to come to Gary's point about CO2 and climate change. Question is it sufficient? And is it adapted to a WTO type situation? And clearly it is not, and it is, depending on which subsidies you look at, because the OECD talks about specific and non-specific, and as you're all aware, in the anti-subsidy agreement we have, or in the subsidies agreement, should I say, we have a requirement of specificity. The other, I think, big issues are that we don't look at outward investment, we don't look at the effect of export subsidies or tariffs and quotas. We are also looking within the OECD at best practice rather than elimination. And in that sense, it is a very comprehensive approach, but not necessarily married to the framework which we have within the WTO. But this does not mean we shouldn't encourage the OECD work. And my basic example is in relation to agriculture. You are all aware of the problem the European Union got into in the 1970s and 1980s. We had a very comprehensive common agricultural policy, the design of which was to boost production in Europe after the disasters of the 40s and 50s. And it was incredibly successful. And within a 20-year period, Europe had gone from a deficit agricultural producer to a surplus agricultural producer through not only subsidies, but through a comprehensive mechanism called the Common Agricultural Policy, which blocked exports and which encouraged certain activities. Ultimately, the European Union began to reform, but the reforms would not have been possible without two things. One is the first work that took place by the OECD, which tried to capture and get an understanding of what the subsidy systems were, not only in the European Union, but in other countries. And then the Uruguay round itself, leading to the agreement on agriculture. The point I want to make is that even though the OECD did an awful lot of the work, the OECD template or framework was not that which was chosen by the WTO. The agreement on agriculture did not take the OECD work, but very much based itself on in counterpoint to the OECD work. Okay. Let us now look at China and steel and anti-subsidy actions. The European Union is not a user of the anti-subsidy or countervailing duty approach. This is for historical reasons, but in practice we have only had 6 cases against subsidies in relation to subsidies in China. 2 of them are in relation to steel, but I've set it up there, the different ones, and you can see the range of duties that have been provided. The subsidies that have been found by the European Union preferential lending, grants, debt for equity swaps, tax exemptions, provision of goods for less than adequate remuneration, which I think is what Robert was talking about, but also then the purchase of goods for more than adequate remuneration. And here, regional subsidy programs. This is something that we really see a difference between, or a multiplication of subsidy programs between central government and regional government. Here we have worked very much within the existing legal framework for capturing and countering subsidies which are incompatible with the WTO rules. But I come back to the question, how, maybe this is the question from the representative of the aluminium industry earlier on, how do we capture this wider cusseting of the industry that we see in this particular slide? State-owned enterprises. These now I'm just going to talk a bit about how the state-owned enterprises work within that cusseted, within the context of the last slide that I've just showed you. State-owned enterprises do not operate on the basis of commercial considerations. And here I've just put up some legal considerations in relation to it. We have had from a wheat panel an idea of what commercial and non-commercial considerations are. And we can see that what is not commercial is what is political. And here we can see that the state-owned enterprises clearly have a function which is political and not commercial. Now, how we're going to address this or what we can do about it is rather difficult. China did sign a protocol of accession to the WTO in which it committed to not operating on non-commercial bases within its state-owned enterprises, but nothing has really been done about this in the 15, 16 years since China's accession. The state-owned enterprises benefit from subsidies, but I put this in just to remind ourselves that the non-state-owned enterprises also benefit from the range of subsidies available. Here, I've also said, that the inputs are really rather important, and so we can't just look at steel production itself, but we must look at the energy, the raw materials, so I think really that you've been able to read those things, the state-owned enterprise. But as I say, the key issue for me is to understand that it is not just state-owned enterprises, it's also non-state-owned enterprises, but that the state-owned enterprises are a vital part of the industry who set the template and who set the prices and set the performance standard that all steel enterprises must meet within the 5-year plans. Like in aluminium, steel enterprises have unsustainable debts. These are CHISA itself. These are the statistics that they have come up with. We have many examples of companies which have been defaulting for years, as I say, we have now the acceptance by China that they do have zombie companies. Now, while it is true that there are certain attempts to deal with these zombie companies, it has not always been implemented in practice, and so we do not have any effective mechanisms to get rid of these. 5 minutes, I've really got to go close. The normal mechanisms for exiting the market do not work. So we now, this is China policy in the steel sector. Competition is to be avoided. and bankruptcy law is not to be enforced. And here we have some examples of how bankruptcy law is not enforced, and we have many examples of price fixing by the CISA. What drives success in China? And here is maybe the quid pro quo that Gary was referring to. Success in China is determined by achievement of the plan, not by profit and loss. And so it is not a market-based mechanism for determining success. It is a political mechanism for determining success. And progress within China, within the party, within the state, is determined by the capacity of the individual to have achieved plans and to have implemented plans. Now, very quickly, I would like to talk about two issues that complainants in the European Union have tried to address this cosseting, this overall plan that China has. And so what we have been able to show is that a whole series of steel producers in China would not be in the market today but for subsidies, and we've seen the same exactly in the aluminium, and that the subsidies are designed to maintain equity and to maintain listing on the stock exchange. So the subsidies vary by year to year depending on what is needed to maintain the equity of the company and maintain the company as a financially healthy entity. Despite the fact that we had 21 clear examples showing this policy by China, the European Union was not in a position to determine that that was a single measure for the protection of the or for the support of or the subsidization of steel in China. And what the European Union did was countervailed 21 companies rather than all. And I think this is a problem that we have, is the quality of the proof that is available. And one thing I think that can be done in this forum, which is a forum which we need more reporting, we might be able to understand what's going on a bit better. The other issue is really, where does the subsidy lie? And this really is a WTO type issue. Does a subsidy have to be completed within the country of origin? And here what we've tried to show is that a subsidy can be completed outside the country of origin. But unfortunately, the European Union has not felt it could go that step further to try and countervail subsidies completed outside the country of origin. I have 3 or 4 very quick slides. Sampling. We don't really have clear rules in the subsidies agreement on sampling. We do have clear rules in the dumping agreement. And so there's a question, should we start looking at this issue in sampling? In particular, should we look at the volume of exports to the export market being determining what the sample of producers should be? Or should we look at the range of subsidies that are available and therefore look at geographic spreads, look at provincial spreads, and the other? Is a big problem. Specificity. We have an issue of specificity. Specificity is not always the specificity rule actually eliminates quite considerable amount of subsidization from WTO review. And the question then is, should we eliminate this specificity? Benefit. How do you capture an issue like too big to fail? If a company is too big to fail, if everybody knows a company is too big to fail, it gets benefit. But that benefit might not be a specific subsidy of X number of dollars. So how are we going to try and address this issue is something that I would like to discuss. And then, of course, prohibited subsidies. Prohibited subsidies are a clear category in our WTO framework. And then the question is, if we create overcapacity, which must be and we create, and part of the creation is through subsidies, should we consider that the export of that overcapacity must automatically be a prohibited subsidy? And there I leave it. I hope I'm in my
Excellent.
time.
Well
Thank you
done.
very much.
Very impressive. And you'll get plenty of time during the discussion.
Okay.
Yes, Bob?
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Robert DeFrancesco. I'm a partner in Wiley Rein's International Trade Practice Group, handling trade remedies. My clients are primarily steel pipe and aluminum, U.S. aluminum companies. And today I was asked to discuss, to follow on Bernard's presentation, how we might think about amending and adjusting the SCM agreement to better address the excess capacity crisis and the subsidies that generate the excess capacity. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through the subsidies we've looked at in certain cases, how they contribute to the excess capacity crisis, and then what we might think about adjusting in the SCM agreement to better and more effectively address those. So, just a little background, and we've heard from the others, obviously there is an excess capacity problem. In steel, we're talking about as much as 350 million tons. In aluminum, it's about 9 million tons, which is 10 times more than total U.S. aluminum production. And this is a slide, I think we've seen this before in Marcus's presentation. You can see Chinese aluminum production is the red line. In a very short period of time, it increases quite significantly. Same is true in steel, whereas aluminum and steel production in the rest of the world remains fairly constant over that period. Now, what drives this? The Chinese themselves, when have recognized that they have a capacity problem, an overcapacity problem in their own planning documents, and they attempt to take steps to eliminate what they call blind expansion. So these are their words, these are not my words. Now, what happens, obviously, when you have this excess capacity problem, and as Marcus already demonstrated, you have falling prices, poor financial performance, and a definite lack of comparative advantage, especially when we're talking about aluminum. Why? One of the main subsidy, and as I said earlier, it's about follow the money. The government ensures a virtually limitless supply of financial contributions through state-owned and directed banks. And there's a quote here from the Fitch financial ratings. China's commercial banks are still expected to support policy objectives and align their strategies with the state's broad economic goals and are frequently urged to do so. And you can read the rest of the quote. Especially in aluminum, China went from having virtually no aluminum production to 56% of total global aluminum production over that period of time, specifically at state direction. And the Chinese have said they view aluminum as critical to their national security and economic well-being, and once that decision is made, resources are funneled into the industry to ensure that happens. This slide's a little complicated. Let me walk you through it. These are stress test financial ratios from the 5 largest aluminum producers in China: Chalco, State Power, Shenhuo, Jisco, and Hongqiao. 4 of these 5 are SOEs, and it's arguable whether Hongqiao is an SOE as of late. What these financial ratios show you is that these companies are essentially economic basket cases. They are extremely highly leveraged. These ratios, by Western standards, are terrible and get worse over time. Yet, these companies continue to get large amounts of funding, which is in this next slide. So the slide to the right, or my right, that's depicts steel capacity. It's the other slide, the other graph there that's critical. The 5 companies I just showed you, those financial ratios, this graph shows you their total capacity and total debt over that period of time. And what you see is the debt keeps going up, The capacity keeps going up, yet their leverage, in the other slide, is horrid. There's no way these companies should still be getting funding, yet they do. And it's that funding that drives the capacity increase. Financing isn't the only problem. We talked about what we call LTARs, the provision of inputs for less than adequate remuneration, and we talked about, especially in aluminum, China's lack of comparative advantage. It's these LTARs that make up for that lack of comparative advantage. In aluminum, the Chinese government will step in and pump in coal for less than adequate remuneration, electricity, alumina, and the like. All of these elements go to reducing the overall cost of production and allow Chinese companies to continue to produce and expand capacity despite the fact that they have no comparative advantage. Now, the SCM agreement does provide the tools to address these issues, we believe. The agreement defines subsidy broadly. It covers contributions by governments, public bodies, and private entities acting for the government. It contemplates subsidies that are targeted to individual firms or groups of firms or industries. It also covers a broad scope of adverse effects that could cause injury, nullification, impairment, serious prejudice, and it defines serious prejudice itself broadly, either displacing or impeding imports, price undercutting, price suppression, depression, increased market share. The recent consultation request filed by the U.S. Regarding aluminum covers these same broad range of subsidies. It details loans for less at non-market rates from public bodies at far below market rates to non-creditworthy companies. Those financial ratios I showed you earlier are one of the mechanisms you would look at when you're considering whether these companies are creditworthy, and I can tell you they are not. And it's directed at the aluminum industry, and it causes price suppression and depression. Building one of these cases, however, is extremely difficult. It is very time-consuming. It requires an awful lot of data analytics, data crunching, and obviously in this instance, an awful lot of translations. While that's taking place, capacity continues to expand, prices continue to collapse, and the industry needs relief and needs relief quickly. So one of the things we're going to look at when I get a little further down is what can we do within the SCM agreement to make this a little more effective, make these cases move a little quicker. And one example might be looking at, can we make particular prohibited subsidies, such as the lending, move that up? What can we increase reporting requirements under Article 25? And can we modify the Annex 5 procedures to make gathering information a little more efficient, a little more effective? So, without further ado, as I said, we believe that the SCM agreement does provide the tools for addressing this problem. However, there's a perception problem. The WTO and the DSB have been criticized at times for calling these types of trade remedies trade restrictive or protectionist. Trade remedies are not protectionist. They are intended to correct the unfair effects of trade practices of one member on another. That perception causes an erosion of the trade remedies regime and compounds the problem. There have been cases where we believe the DSB has inappropriately interpreted the SCM agreement to create standards and thresholds that aren't supported by the text. At least that's my contention. And it makes addressing and tackling the systemic problems that we see in these overcapacity issues with respect to steel and aluminum, it compounds the problem, makes it more difficult. And the erosion of members' abilities to use trade remedies creates a moral hazard and encourages member states and their companies to engage in unfair trade practices. One of the decisions we'll talk about in a few minutes with respect to public bodies and entrustment and direction, that interpretation of the SCM agreement makes addressing some of these LTARs more problematic, and we believe is incorrect. And in fact, the causation requirements that have been articulated with respect to serious prejudice, again, this is a language that the appellate body has used regarding genuine and substantial relationship. That is a causal requirement that arguably is not supported by the agreement and potentially presents a higher threshold that we believe is inappropriate. So what happens when you erode some of these trade remedies regimes? It obviously has a chilling effect. It's why we're here now talking about how do we fix the SCM agreement to make addressing these types of overcapacity issues more effective. Again, it feeds the perception that the WTO maybe is not equipped, or that the SCM agreement is not equipped to effectively address some of these problems. So, possible solutions. Item 1 here talks about the possibility of amending Article 5 to specifically call out excess capacity, where we would provide some language that talks about when subsidies are found to be specific and a member's capacity levels of a particular like product over a period of time have suppressed or depressed another member's like product. You've satisfied the requirement, and at that point, you don't need to proceed. It's presumed to be actionable. Now, the other side of that coin would be simply to bring back Article 6.1, which, as everyone knows, lapsed. It's the flip side of the proposal just talked about, where once you've demonstrated that you hit a certain threshold of subsidization above a de minimis level, again, you've presumed to have violated the agreement, that it is actionable, and there's another more effective way of addressing the same issue. Obviously, Article 27.8 talks about a rebuttable presumption for developing members. With respect to the capacity crisis with aluminum and steel, I don't believe doesn't inherently make this type of provision less effective. It would be something, obviously, that you would have to address, but in and of itself, I don't see it as a problem. Okay, we talked earlier about financing, and as I said, the overcapacity crisis is principally about following the money. So any solution or any attempt to address the SCM agreement and how to make it more effective at tackling that financing, one avenue to go down or to look at is amending Article 3 to expressly include non-commercial financing as a prohibited subsidy. So what might that look like? Article 3.2 you could amend to cover things as listed here in A, B, C, and D: direct transfers of funds to cover operating losses, forgiveness of debt, loans to enterprises that are uncreditworthy, and debt to equity swaps. That could just be added directly as a prohibited subsidy. And when you're looking at creditworthiness, you would examine something to the effect of the present and past financial indicators and stress test ratios, the same ratios I just showed you, the enterprise's recent and past present ability to meet or cover its fixed cost and its financial obligations, evidence of the enterprise's future financial positions, market studies, and value of collateral or guarantee provided on commercial terms. I would note here, when looking at creditworthiness, this mere existence of potentially third-party private lenders in whatever lending package does not in and of itself mean that whatever lending was provided was at creditworthy terms. And that's something that needs to be looked at when we go down this road. And one other item that Bernard had talked about as it relates to an implicit government guarantee, when looking at this type of lending, part of that implicit government guarantee is related to credit rating agencies, both inside China and outside of China. And when you look at the lending that goes on to at least the Chinese aluminum industry, you'll see Chinese credit rating agencies rating companies like Chalco as triple B or triple A, the highest credit rating you could achieve in China. When Western credit rating agencies review the same company, oftentimes they're rated, and Chalco is a specific example, is rated triple B minus. And the same credit rating agency also tries to take into account the implicit government guarantee and will adjust that credit rating even further. Now, one way of tackling that implicit government guarantee might be when you get to the adjusting the benefit, or when you're calculating the amount of the subsidy, that benchmark that you use, you can adjust it to reflect the amount of that implicit government guarantee to try and get at that, as Bernard was talking about. So, equity worthiness. Again, these are items you might consider when looking at equity worthiness. The objective analysis of the future financial prospects of a recipient or enterprise. You might look at market studies, economic forecast, current and past indicators of financial health. Again, those ratios, the stress test ratios I just showed you. The enterprise's rate of return on equity 3 years prior, and whether the enterprise itself is a state-owned enterprise. Again, going back to Marcus's example when he was talking about debt-to-equity swaps, in the aluminum industry especially, we've seen companies like Chalco, where in China, if you have losses 3 years in a row, you will be delisted from their stock exchange. What we've seen, not so much as a debt-to-equity swap, although that's occurring now, is they will take assets and sell those assets back to their corporate parent, and it's the sale of those assets that generates the profit. And without that sale of those assets, they would have had losses for more than 3 years in a row. So once you've satisfied those criteria, obviously if it's a red box prohibited subsidy, it would be presumed to have adverse effects, and you would satisfy that criteria, and it would automatically be actionable. You might consider exemptions for small business programs or subsidies for national security and defense. It could be crafted in that way. There's a similar EU proposal with respect to Article 3 and prohibited subsidies. The language from that proposal, and you can see it here in B, where it talks about subsidies for cash grants, capital injections, provisions of assets. The key clause there is without a credible restructuring plan. My personal view of that is that's potentially problematic when addressing the overcapacity crisis. Obviously, the main cause of the capacity crisis is the continued financing of firms that would otherwise have exited the industry, and allowing for restructuring so that those firms may continue in the industry doesn't solve the problem, potentially. And you have to look no further than these three examples, Hongqiao being one of them. They had defaulted on their lending at the end of 2016 and 17, and then CITIC, the Chinese state-owned investment fund, stepped in and essentially bailed them out. Chalco is another example that Marcus just talked about, where they've instituted these debt-to-equity swaps to essentially restructure the debt. So whether that is a credible restructuring plan or not, it's a potential loophole, and it could be problematic. Other things to look at. Obviously, provisions of inputs for less than adequate remuneration needs to be addressed. One way to do that is to also make it a prohibited subsidy. You might do that by modifying Article 3.1b, which, as you all know, it's an absolute obligation with respect to import substitution, but it could be amended to also include encouragement or inducement to favor domestic inputs. So it's not an absolute one-for-one, and this may get at some of the LTARs like coal and the like. Obviously, we also talked about increased transparency requirements. There's obviously an obligation to use Article 25 and report a member's subsidies. Obviously, members have not been doing that, China specifically. So I think we should look at giving more teeth to the reporting requirements, and there's some proposals here. One thing you might look at would be a bar or prohibiting a member from raising subsidy claims themselves if they have not reported their own subsidies under Article 25. Or if you have a member who has not affirmatively reported their own subsidies, if another member can demonstrate subsidies do exist and that they are in fact actionable, they ought to be presumed to be actionable at that point. you could add some real teeth to the reporting requirement. And as I said before, I think we ought to look at strengthening the Annex 5 procedures. As I said, putting a serious prejudice case together is extremely time-consuming. There's an awful lot of information that has to be gathered, not a lot of which is easily accessible. In recent cases, the DSB has been handling greater amounts of business proprietary information, and there's no reason why the Annex 5 procedure could not be adjusted so that actual subsidy questionnaires went to member countries and member enterprises, and that information was gathered through those questionnaires, similar to what goes on at both the EU and in the US. And then, as I said before, certain decisions, it would be helpful if they were addressed specifically in the agreement. The one I'm thinking of specifically, which is the AD-CVD agreement, with regard to public body, we believe that the DSB got this wrong, and it's fueled confusion and debate over when entity is a public body. The agreement should be amended so that the definition of public body is clarified, in the sense that it must be understood to be broader than an entity that exercises a government function. This type of interpretation, we believe, doesn't comport with practical and commercial reality, especially when dealing with China, as you heard from Bernard. It just makes addressing these LTARs more complicated, more difficult, not impossible, but it complicates it, and it should be amended and addressed. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Marc?
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here today. My name's Marc Wu. I'm a law professor at Harvard. I'm going to play a slightly different role on this panel. What you've heard are a number of presentations about what's happening today, and also the ways in which the existing law have been effective and its limits in terms of dealing with some of the issues about overcapacity, and particularly Chinese subsidies. And what I'm going to do today is to ask you to imagine what happens in a dynamic case scenario whereby we have a number of these different cases at CVDs, at the domestic level, WTO cases that are brought forth about actionable subsidies with adverse effects. Then what happens? And I think this is important if you're going to play the role to ask yourself, if we're going to amend the SCM agreement, what direction should we move in? And if we don't do anything, what can we expect to happen in the global trading system? So there are a couple of key points that I want to make, and I'm just going to highlight them all up front because I realized I'm the fifth speaker at the end of a long 2-hour session. Your brains are probably thinking more about lunch than what I have to say. So in case you tune out, the key points I want to make today are basically, well, the SCM agreement, as you've heard, is equipped to address certain subsets of issues, but that there are a number of different ways in which, as good lawyers, you can easily circumvent WTO law to try to help your companies remain afloat despite global overcapacity. And while we've talked a lot about China this morning, these tools are available to be deployed by a range of different economies, including advanced economies that don't have anything close to the Chinese economic structure. This is what makes it difficult about thinking about amendments to the SCM agreement, because you may wish, on the one hand, to address these existing problems about a unique economic structure, but on the other hand, your Treasury and other officials inside your own government are going to worry about whether you're tying your own hands in certain ways. But my last point is, unless there are some coordinated efforts to address these legal gaps, it's very rational what's playing out in the global trading system today, which is governments, especially large, sizable ones, will resort to unilateral actions to address these problems. So why is this the case? Well, let's start by just asking ourselves very simply, what's the problem? Right? We're talking about subsidies essentially shifting the supply curve, bring prices down and increasing the amounts of quantity, right? This is from Economics 101. So this asks the question, why isn't the rest of the world just happy? Why aren't you just sending a thank you note? Because after all, prices are just cheaper. And the problem, of course, is the quintessential one that the global trading system is designed to resolve, which is that there are negative externalities to trade. Now, what negative externalities are we talking about? Specifically, well, the adjustment leads to unemployment, but the subsidies cause your trading partners to bear a disproportionate share of that unemployment cost. And importantly, this is not just in the sector itself. Now, on this slide here, if you think about there's an input and then there are downstream sectors, those green dots representing those, over the course of time as firms disappear, but only in one part and not in other governments, what happens? Well, you start having the excess capacity countries start to export to supply that. But also what happens here, you have firms move over to be closer to the supply chains in those other markets as well. And what this means is that there are additional second-order negative effects that tie to not just employment, but innovation, cluster manufacturing, and so on and so forth. This is also, to Gary's question earlier, why do governments do this? Right? After all, this is an efficient sector and so forth. They're spending, they're dumping bad money after bad industries. Well, they're doing this to keep employment up, but they also recognize there are positive externalities as far as they are concerned in terms of innovation, cluster manufacturing, and drawing the supply chain over onto their markets. So the current SCM agreement works to combat certain excess capacity subsidies, particularly, we've heard where there's a defined government measure, you're supplying, these LTAR inputs, there's procurement above market rates, there's financing at below market rates, and so forth. This is leading to CVD cases, WTO cases. But the question I always ask my students as a law professor is, you have these cases, they turn out one way or the other. What happens if policy measure is declared illegal? You still want to keep reaping its positive benefits. What can you do? And as a good lawyer, we're all trained to think about these types of questions. And in this particular instance, how one can circumvent the law is essentially by removing the fingerprint of the state. And how can you do so? We haven't seen this done so far today, but the key message that I want to ask you to think about is, how can we go about removing the fingerprint of the state in response to the set of CVD and WTO cases today as these rulings play themselves out? And so one way you can do so is to say, well, there's no actual policy measure. And Bernard has already alluded to that, about the difficulties of proving that there's an actual policy measure. And if not, then you have to go one by one by one by one. There's no actual broad-based claim. The other is to take away any form of explicit direction or entrustment. So without that explicit direction or entrustment, it's not necessarily a public body. There's just these implicit quid pro quo benefits. And we'll get to a question, well, why would these private entities or quasi-private entities engage in this type of quid pro quo? The other way to circumvent is, of course, right now we have this specificity requirement that's been alluded to. So you can turn something and just make it not specific. And since this one is easier to understand than the other, I'm going to begin here. But we've talked about inputs being provided at subsidized prices. This is the classic one that you think of. Let's just say the red dots here represent steel or aluminium companies or whatever other input that's facing overcapacity, and yellow represents everyone else. You think about these as getting prices at less than adequate remuneration, So this is clearly a subsidy. It's clearly specific today. Even if you change this and you said, well, we just presented all of these, these are all located disproportionately in one region. Even if you're providing a subsidized price, it's not just to the steel or aluminum companies, but it is to that one region. Even today, this is considered specific, and if you need a reminder from WTO law as to why that's the case, well, you have a designated geographical entity, that's receiving the subsidy, but it's not being provided across the board by this national energy company. And here in the SCM agreement, paragraph 2.2, if it's limited to certain enterprises within a designated geographical area within the jurisdiction of the granting authority, it shall be made considered specific. So ask yourself in this type of scenario, how do you turn this so that it's not specific? And this gets to the problem that we face today, that many of these are provided not by, remember the last chart I had national energy, right? But they're provided by what you could do is to transform this into sub-central units. So what if we had, right, instead of this national energy, we had 3 regional entities supplying inputs, and this is quite common. If you think about just your own jurisdictions, right, you have regional power authorities, regional water, regional electricity and the like, and what if Region A just happened to provide, right, this at 50 rather than 100? All of a sudden, right, that looks effectively the same as what was previous, but with Region A doing so, now this is no longer limited to a certain designated geographical area within its jurisdiction. This is the entire jurisdiction, so it's not limited. And if you think there are other parts of the ESCM agreement, well, could you look to paragraph 1 of Article 2 to do this? Well, it's not necessarily given disproportionately to certain firms, certain enterprises, and so on and so forth. Everyone in the region gets this. Now you ask yourself, well, why would they do so? But just think to yourself, right, about your own water, power, and so on and so forth, fossil fuel prices, oil prices. There are price controls for many of these for energy inputs and many of your own entities. And so essentially, where we have problems is where low-cost input is provided by a subcentral unit at regulated prices. The prices will vary across jurisdictions, but not within a jurisdiction, and that this manner of providing input and collection is done through standard mechanisms. So there's no special deal that's being provided, but certainly this is providing an input that's helping all of this out. And the existing law, I would argue, right, because this escapes specificity, doesn't really allow for addressing this, which creates this essential problem of when all of this is done is through subcentral units, right, what does this do? Land is an even trickier case, I would argue. Right? So what's a special versus ordinary deal? What's the right comparator when you have something that's heavily zoned versus not heavily zoned, if it's not being zoned at all? If the government owns the land, it becomes even trickier, and the government's doing long-term leases. Is it allowed to consider externalities when it does its pricing? Certainly other land leasing authorities consider externalities. Is the government not allowed to do so? Does it need to make those explicit? And what if it's being done through an independent third-party agent? The agent then leases the property. How do we think about what's an appropriate arm's length transaction or not? So land is an even trickier input here, where we talk about, is the existing law, how do we deal with less than adequate remuneration? Now, the other scenario, of course, is this one that I discussed earlier, which is essentially, right, playing mind games. Right? Government doesn't have to say anything. We all know how this works, and we all understand why there are benefits given the economic structure we operate in, why we do certain things that the government likes for us to do without the government actually having to say or having to ask. And how would this work? Well, let's think about this scenario here, just this quick graphic that I've thrown up. Again, 2 different, right, countries that's providing subsidies in the rest of the world. The black here represent relatively healthy firms. Okay, the bright red represents companies in the red, so unhealthy firms altogether, and then you've got shades of gray or shades of pink as you move from less healthy to more healthy. The firms A through E are in the country that's subsidizing, and then W through Z are in the rest of the world. If this played out according to market mechanisms, of course, right, and they differ because, of course, right, firms' overall balance sheet health do differ in industry over the course of time. They have different capital investment structures and so forth. But this played out according to market mechanisms. You'd expect, right, those firms in the red to just disappear. Eventually, over the course of time, there's still excess capacity, so everyone's balance sheets look worse, right? Then the ones which are still bankrupt, right, they disappear over the course of time. And at some point, you get to a level where capacity corrects, and then everyone returns back to health. Right? So this is what you would expect to see happen. Now let's look at what happens if there's excess capacity here. Again, same chart that we started out with, but instead of just allowing market mechanisms to take place, right? Certain firms on the left side happen to decide that they want to engage in mergers and acquisitions of other less healthy firms in their country. Now, lest you think this only happens in China, remember this happened in the West during the global financial crisis. We can have A through E just represent banks, right? And you remember very well, right, that you had these types of mergers and acquisitions which happened across industries. They happen in lots of unhealthy industries as well, right, even without something as extreme as a financial crisis. But look at what happens here, right? Then what happens, right, only, right, company Z disappears, the rest of these merge. Obviously, the healthier firms are hurt somewhat by having absorbed, right, certain companies onto their balance sheets, but there's still much more excess capacity. As that happens, right, additional firms disappear, but there are additional mergers that might take place here on the left, and as those mergers play themselves out, right, capacity still hasn't resolved its own problems, and then other firms continue to disappear. Eventually, you get to a stable equilibrium point, and here's who's still left standing at the end of all this. Now, all of this just goes to show you, right, why these mergers and acquisitions really do affect market dynamics over the course of time. Now, WTO law still works fine if, right, the firms making these acquisitions are SOEs, they're being directed to do so by government guidance, or even if they're private entities, but this is at the direction of the government, and that we're showing that there's an artificial price transfer that's being played out here, and there's being backed up by, say, financing for this transaction. To back this up, it's through some forms of soft budget constraints. But here's where problems could emerge. Let's imagine that all those firms I just showed you were private or quasi-state entities, and there is no evidence of direction or entrustment, right? There is no financing per se at a preferential rate. There's no explicit quid pro quo. There's just an implicit understanding that if I partake in doing this, this will help me in the long run. And unless, again, I bring you back to the financial crises, right, where sometimes, right, you were told, some countries told, you need to absorb these things onto the balance sheet, but with car companies and so on and so forth, right, sometimes these happen because companies just understand, right, this is what I need to do over the course of time. And how can you tell if this transaction is one that wouldn't have been done by a healthier firm in this type of instance anyway, right? This gets to the trickiness of asking, right, what happens if there's not this type of direct direction or entrustment? I'm going to go through a couple of other examples very quickly. Balance sheet transfers, we've all heard about. This is a common structure. You've got a holding company, lots of different. This could describe SASAC, as Bernard alluded to earlier, but it could also describe a Western private equity company with a bunch of portfolio companies. Normally, right, as this turns unprofitable, it disappears, it might go bankrupt, you absorb it all back on. But what you could do instead was Robert alluded to, you could transfer assets over to the holding company to keep it afloat. You could also transfer debt to the holding company and restructure the debt. The holding company, by holding the debt, is obviously much healthier balance sheet. Banks are willing to do this just through the market mechanism. And so again, right, WTO law works fine. If these holding companies are state entities, they're directly controlled. Prices being paid here are artificial. All the debt negotiations being done with a state-owned bank at the direction of the state. But if that's not the case, if this is all just private entities, if this is just what we see happening in private equity firms, right, one portfolio company being absorbed, being kept afloat, and there's just this implicit understanding that if I do this, right, if I keep this afloat, this will help later on my airline company or my tech company or so on and so forth, right? This gets to the question of, this is not necessarily bad money going after, right, bad deals or anything like that. There are some long-run gains and efficiencies for the holding company to play itself out as it is, right? It recoups it through its other portfolio companies. And so how can you tell if this is one that wouldn't have happened necessarily in the private sector? But again, here, notice the government doesn't have to say or do anything. It's just rational for the holding company to do so, right? Now, that equity swaps, another type of scenario, right? You may have a bankrupt or close to teetering steel company, right, or aluminum company engaging these equity swaps. The number of players obviously affect the terms of these swaps. So we have a scenario here, but obviously if we get to more players that are interested in doing this, this improves the terms of swap for the steel company, okay? So, right, if you only have 9, you're going to get worse, but if the demand goes up higher and you've got 25 of these funds or players, right, they eventually want to hold after these the debt instruments and the bond markets and so forth, right, this improves. So WTO law works fine again, right, if all of this is being directed by the state, it's the financial institutions of the state that are involved in these types of swaps, these prices are artificially high and so forth. But what if it's just a scenario where there's just a lot of private players that are just taking place in these types of transactions? They're just interested in doing so without direction or entrustment from the state. And there's an artificial price that's driven up. This is just a bubble, but this is driven up by higher than expected demand. And there's this implicit understanding that by being one of those yellow bubbles, right, by showing some interest, there's some gain to me in the long run from taking part in this type of structure. How can you tell if it's truly inflated versus one that you're just trying to send a signal? So again, here's another example, right, where you have all this. And so how do these implicit understandings emerge? Well, they emerge through networks outside of government. And I think given the focus on China, obviously a lot of the focus has been on the party or the party state structure, right? That taking this outside the formal mechanism of the state, this is where the implicit understandings emerge. But ask yourselves also, in a non-China context, we also in the West have these types of implicit understandings, and they emerge through these same types of social clubs or social right, networks that happen as well. And it's not to say only the right exists in China or only the left doesn't exist in China, right? And outside of China, right, there are other political parties where there are these terms which are understood, particularly where there's one dominant political party that's been in place for a long period of time. So my point here is implicit understandings of this form, right, this mind science, works best when you have a limited group that controls access to financing or to some form of critical structures that most business need to hold, if they exert influence over promotion or compensation, and where government is able to assert certain types of choke points, not necessarily for steel or for aluminum or any of these input industries, right, but for other types of regulatory or investment approval, and where government procurement plays a major role. And in those types of instances, right, you can have, right, make the fingerprint disappear. Now, I'm just very quickly going to go through some other procedural considerations. Obviously, under existing WTO law with the public body jurisprudence, direction and entrustment is critical. But if this wasn't publicly available through something like a 5-year plan or through some government document and so forth, if you have to gather this, I think there's a procedural question that comes into place. If this is done through confidential sources or if it's done through your espionage agencies, how do you present this type of evidence for WTO litigation and offer the respondent a chance to respond to the evidence without undermining your confidence that you're going to reveal how you gather this, which might be beneficial? And this has a chilling mechanism in terms of wanting to turn to a mechanism like the WTO to litigate these types of cases. The other procedural issues that I want to bring into mind here, everyone's aware of the remedies gap, right? It takes a number of different years to bring one of these cases. Even if you prevail, the measure disappears. If there's no measure or the measure is just that one financing, what good is it? Right, your factories have disappeared. These second-order harms have already happened. There's no compensation for the lingering harm. So what does this all mean? Obviously, you should go through unilateral channels, right? And possibly not even through trade remedies, but trying to work this out through assertions of power. So in sum, just to wrap up here, right, there is WTO litigation cases, but we shouldn't pat ourselves too hard on the back here in this house just to say, there are all these cases on steel and aluminum, therefore the law works exactly fine as it is. There are lots of loopholes in the law. They've nowhere been close to be exploited, but the ability of government or country to do so will vary greatly depending on its economic control structures. And as more WTO rulings find certain practices to be illegal, this is going to drive more and more of this towards these non-state directed actions based on these types of implicit understandings. And unless we can fix these gaps, I think we're going to see more and more unilateral measures. This is going to be difficult, but this is my charge to you, say, you better do something, because otherwise the relevance of all of this is going to just shift outside to these types of unilateral pressures on the trading system, which none of us are very much happy about, given what's going on today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. I was very mean to the three speakers and gave them very little time so that we'd have a lot of time for discussion. I'm assuming there's some interest in that. And certainly I have some. So I would note a couple things which Mark helpfully pointed out. I go back to something Karl said also. One of the beauties, but also one of the cautions about the WTO system is the same rules apply to everyone. The same rules apply to all industries. One of the problems with the existing subsidies agreement and some of the other agreements is you have specific industries that lobbied for specific provision the regional industries one is one of them. And the negotiations were full of how, well, we bluntly, we have to fix Japan. It was a very Japan-centric negotiation. Well, no one's actually saying that anymore. And guess what? Those rules then apply to everyone. As Marc gently hinted, our own country, 1,000 municipal electric companies, 6 huge federal electric companies. We pretend it's all the electricity is private. Most of it isn't, or not most, but a large chunk isn't. We have a very senior official in the government who publicly intervenes and tells businesses what to do at a very micro level. Let's say you have let's say you have government procurement contracts with the federal government. You're the recipient of one of those, or you need to take his pipeline example. You need federal permits on federal land, so you have to buy locally. Makes sense from a U.S. point of view, maybe, but I'm not sure all the other WTO members would like that. As we go through the discussion, bear in mind Marc's caution. Some things are best done, if there's a specific problem, fix the problem. Don't fix it with a general rule, fix it with a specific solution. I'm not saying that's the answer here. The subsidies agreement was really negotiated in seriously 1990, 91 through December 93. That was a long time ago in subsidy terms. And lots of things have changed, and no one anticipated a developing country with $3 trillion in reserves. It was a fight between the U.S., EU, and Canada over their own specific controversies. So the subsidies agreement, as you read through it, is littered with cases involving industries in those 3 countries. That's not a good basis for an agreement that has to cover all industries in, how many now? 169 members? 74? No, more than that. 64, is that all? I thought it was higher. But there'll be more. So many of whom, I note, exceeded after the agreement. And so the agreement wasn't designed to deal with them. And that's not just China, that's a lot of countries, and there's still a few out there. So with that general framework in mind, I would note that there's a lot to discuss here. I have a couple questions which occurred to me after the last one, so I'm going to put them on the table for our experts here, which involve foreign investment. So does China limit foreign investment still, they used to, in steel and aluminium? Primary.
So the answer is yes, at least to some degree. There are caps on the amount of shares that outside investors.
34% still?
Right.
For steel, is that true for aluminium?
I believe so. Oddly, the Chinese, as part of their, what they call the going out strategy, provide financing and large amounts of support to Chinese companies to go outside of China to purchase the raw materials needed. As an example, GISCO, which is a large state-owned entity who started producing steel, and now they're one of the largest aluminum producers in China. They just recently purchased a bauxite mine in Jamaica from Rusal using funding from that going out strategy. Hongqiao is another example. They purchased bauxite mines in Guinea and Indonesia using the same funding. So
sounds like Exim Bank. Sorry. Jean?
I would say that in the steel industry, China's explicit prohibitions on foreign investment in the steel sector have loosened, but they still have guidelines on certain sectors, and NDRC review, National Development and Reform Commission review, so that makes it extremely difficult to get through sometimes. Also, I would echo what Robert has said about the going out policy. That is sort of more guidance. It's less. It's more difficult to find the explicit subsidies for going out, but that China is actively engaged in shifting some of the new investment in steel and aluminum to other countries, and so you may be competing with Chinese supported capacity that is not in China, but in third countries or indeed in your own economy. This is particularly important in light of the One Belt, One Road policy, where China has a very ambitious design to increase the role of Chinese companies in a wide variety of countries in One Belt and One Road. And that this is not limited only, or that this kind of Chinese support for new capacity is not limited only to primary or simple industries like steel and aluminum, but also now to more high-tech companies and industries, such as recently has been made clear in the Made in China 2025 policy. Thank you.
Anyone? I asked because it's interesting. China, the star industry for getting subsidies in most of the developed world is automobiles. For some reason, automobile plants attract the biggest subsidies and the most drooling by local officials. And China permits, actually at the time encouraged, 50% foreign ownership there. I've never figured out why steel was so sensitive, except, I don't know, long-lost memories of the Industrial Revolution. But it's an interesting choice.
I would just like to add, it's not just really the question of the percentage ownership of the shares. It's much more important, and I think we are aware of certain intellectual property problems technology transfer problems, but it's also a problem of effective control. From what I understand from certain of the companies, they, despite the apparent capacity to be involved in decision making, it just doesn't happen. It's that simple.
I've had the opposite experience, so it may be vary. But let me now focus this. So what changes, this is the panel and the audience, what changes would you make, you've heard from the panel, what changes would you make in the current agreement and that would apply to your own country or entity as well, of course? Any takers?
So, Gary, I will start. I actually have a slide to this effect. So I think Robert mentioned a number in his presentation, and what I wanted to draw attention to in my presentation is to say I think there are a number of different areas. If you are to focus on could changing the law actually address the problem in the long term, right? You're going to have to look at the public body test, and there's a lot of controversy over the current jurisprudence, but whether or not the requirement of direction entrustment offers just too much leeway for countries to get away with these informal, as I say, fingerprints off type of policies.
So is a tweet from the president direction and entrustment?
So I think these are the types of, on the other hand, right, if you move to a more formalist test, are you going to capture too much, right? This is the controversy I think that plays out here.
But also how much evidence do you need? You can't just assume it.
Yeah.
Keep
Right.
going.
I think I was going to say, I think Robert may chime in, right, to say I think there are some in the U.S. government who would favor moving towards other ways besides showing direction and entrustment, right? And he's also touched on going beyond traditional government function as well, right? So.
Right, that's right. So when you're looking at, especially for LTARs, you may have a state-owned company that controls a very large portion of the raw material that's being produced, but not all of it. And the degree to which that state-owned entity can influence pricing within China and the other market players, the degree to which they have market power, ought to be something that you're looking at, beyond a simply, did the state pick up the phone and tell the sales director what price to sell at, which is currently what might be the test that people are looking at. And that's not, as Marc, as what you were talking about, this hands-off approach. That's not what's happening in China. If you have Communist Party members sitting on the boards of directors and they're influencing the degree to which certain managers are getting promotions, hitting bonus targets, and whether you've complied with certain directives from the state is influencing whether I get that promotion or hit that bonus target, that is a way of entrusting and directing beyond simply picking up the phone and telling the sales manager to sell input A at price B.
But how do you prove it?
Well, I think what we've seen in the U.S. is where the Commerce Department asks the Chinese government for that information related to what's going on in those meetings, the information is not provided. And so under facts available, it's plugged.
And again, Marc has helpfully reminded us, in the global financial crisis, long ago, so we don't have to worry that it will never happen again, right? Couldn't possibly happen because all the reforms have happened, so banks are perfectly safe now, right? So if you believe that, good luck. So assuming it could happen again, every major government did all of that and more, with the most important input, which was money. And indeed, U.S. interest rates are still way below what a market would do for reasons of macroeconomics. The main victims are senior citizens on fixed incomes, but we've seen interest rates at very low rates because the government supplied it. So the global financial crisis, all these rules somehow were ignored. So I repeat, can we get rules that governments, once they sit down and think about it, will agree to? But keep going, so specificity.
The next one, I think, was similar to what we've both flagged on this panel, is the specificity question, right? I think all three of us alluded to it to some extent. But the point that I wanted to, hopefully you took away from my presentation, is you could slice and dice this in such a way, right, so as to make this non-specific. So do we need to declare or have a much more exhaustive list of what's considered de facto specific? And if so, how do you craft that, especially for these less than adequate remuneration inputs up front?
U.S. in the aircraft cases got very generous non-specificity treatment for what U.S. states do.
And just to follow on your point, Marc, with respect to aluminum, obviously, one of the largest inputs is the electricity. Right. And it's often very difficult to demonstrate specificity with respect to electricity, even in China, because of the way they've set the system up. It's a little easier where you have a state-owned utility, but short of that, you're absolutely right. It becomes more difficult, and it's something that ought to be looked at.
I think this specificity really does go beyond China. I mean,
Exactly.
And it is very important because you have, particularly in energy-rich countries, for steel, for aluminium, for fertilizers and the like, you have single price policies. or you can call it dual price because the export price and the domestic price are different. So this is specificity is not a China issue. It is a much wider systemic issue.
It actually started, if you want to date it, to 1980 in this building, when the representatives, I think it was called the European Communities then, said that the U.S. was fixing natural gas prices. And the U.S. replied, but everyone gets them. Hasn't changed. We don't fix the prices anymore. But this is, as I say, it all sounds good. Let's change these rules to take care of the China overcapacity one. We just have to design them, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. Just saying we're going to have to get agreement from our own governments and every other government. And these do hit everyone and everything. Please.
Thank you. Martin Geira from the EU. Picking up on what Bernard was saying, that the issues we're discussing here are not limited to China only. One thing is, of course, to discuss things that can be improved in the SCM agreement. The other thing is to get everybody's agreement, including the Chinese agreement. Would you see, or would you identify areas that would be of interest to China or to other developing countries in return for changing, for example, some of these rules that we touched upon?
Good negotiator's question.
That's one of the things, of course, that, yes, we pose ourselves, and I would like to hear your views on that. Thank you.
I didn't quite make the point in agriculture that I wanted to make. And I think the point there was that the domestic political situation in the European Union at the time was not capable of resolving the internal political problems that it had, even though most observers within the EU were aware of the external costs of our domestic policy. In other words, the external cost of our domestic policy was that we depressed world market prices, we drove farmers off the land in third countries, but we kept them on the land in the European Union, and we satisfied our own domestic needs. Now, and I wonder the extent to which certain of the issues that we face in, and not only in China, but a couple of other countries, where there is a domestic difficulty in taking certain types of decisions, could not be a starting point for discussions, whereby if it's not possible to do something domestically, well, maybe you need to start looking at it internationally, which is essentially what drove the Uruguay round, as the European Union was not able to do things. We also then had, which was very useful at the time, we had the development of a number of negotiation groups. So, in fact, the beginning of this GX, GY, G number, whatever, is really the Cairns Group, which was a group of countries with agricultural comparative advantage who were losing out because of the rapid fall in the in global prices and the subsidy war between the United States and the EU at that time. So I would try and explore, first of all, on the political level, the extent to which there might be interest in some countries to actually resolve certain domestic problems. We know in China in particular that there have been a number of attempts to try and get rid of zombie companies, to try and do these sort of things, but it has just not come about because of political difficulties between the centre and the provinces.
I think, if I could add, I think there's an important point there that both you are raising. So the WTO in general and the gap before it are pretty obviously mutual hand-tying solutions. They're really prisoner's dilemma solutions. And in case of at least some subsidies, in my recollection on steel, it's very much provincial more than central. I'm not saying there's no central, but it's very provincial. It's the same with subsidies by states within the U.S. There's no, it's just wasted money. Companies play off one province against another. And with some of the industry, particularly for China, there's a huge environmental cost to burning up a lot of soft coal to make metal. So someone, the Chinese government's worried about that. So it's, what you outlined is actually a good idea for a tool to look for those places where the Chinese government would have an interest in restraining what's going on in China. And as, the original Chinese accession is widely regarded, at the time at least, as having been a tool by some forces within China to impose a reformist agenda on the Chinese economy, which was true of NAFTA in Mexico, for example. So this is external hand-tying can be useful. Again, I'm not saying this is going to work across the board by any means. I'm not naive about how to do this, but that's one vector. It's not the only one to look for is where that might work. Please.
So let me offer just a couple of other quick thoughts here. I think the former trade negotiator part of me would say certainly there are enough pieces even within the rules negotiations. China's advanced forward a number of its offensive interests, particularly with respect to trade remedies. These can be packaged big or small, but certainly even within CVD, right, the continued ability to rely upon non-market economy, adverse facts available, so forth, within the AD context. Sorry, all of these are places where there is some ability for negotiations. But the once one steps away from all this, and the more academic part of me would say, well, what is the thing that you're most concerned with in terms of implementing this type of policy? Because obviously, when Chinese policymakers see those same graphs, they know that there's an overcapacity. And what they're really trying to work through is an employment issue. And it's managing the pace of the economic transformation, and they have a very different solution than Western economies do about not necessarily relying upon social welfare systems to manage that transition. And I think they've looked at what's played out the last couple of years in the West as indication that those social welfare structures may not necessarily be the best way by which to manage this. So unless we find ways that can assuage those, find ways to employ, this is right, tens of millions of workers, right, in other sectors, I think there's going to be a lot of hesitancy to remake radical reforms.
Could I just add something too? If we continue to have an effective dispute settlement mechanism, and the next years will determine that, I think there is probably more scope for coordinated effort in relation to positions taken before or within dispute settlement than there is in getting an immediate agreement on certain things. And I think this is something that really needs to be looked at better, is better coordination in dispute settlement.
One note I would add, and someone mentioned Chinese offensive interests. Well, maybe we want to be careful of what we ask for. China, no one seems to realize this outside of maybe this room. China has already countervailed U.S. government procurement, grain subsidies, and the automobile bailout. And USTR did not challenge any of those Chinese findings. So it's perfectly imaginable that China, viewed as a recipient of trade remedy law, is also a major user, and it's a very large market, extremely large. For things, it's the largest market in the world. So, as I said, be careful what you ask for. Jean, feel free to comment.
Just, I wanted to clarify something on the issue of state or provincial subsidies. I think the two are just simply not equivalent to U.S. state subsidies versus the Chinese provincial subsidies. First of all, there are many large central government subsidies going to SASAC, government direction of central government banks to central government SOEs to do debt for equity swaps. So there's subsidies at all levels of the government, and the provincial subsidies that are going on are in part to implement central government directives. So that's one thing. The other thing is, we had an expansion of 350 million metric tons in China's capacity between 2009 and the present, and that is more than the total U.S. capacity and total EU capacity combined, just since 2009. And so that's the scale is just not even close either. Now, most of that did meet Chinese domestic demand, but it's clearly gone way beyond Chinese domestic demand. And you do have also the situation of Chinese domestic firms suffering from internal competition, but from too much capacity. So perhaps the enlightened self-interest approach to China, not only by creating pain from the excess capacity being shifted to global markets, but also to appeal to their internal desires to modernize, to make them more market-oriented, to make the companies more market-oriented, and to reduce pollution, which is killing millions of people as we speak in China. Thank you.
Thanks.
So in terms of thinking about solution, would be helpful regarding the text of the agreement. I just wanted to get back to the concept of prohibited subsidies, because as you realize, this concept makes it much easier to bring the case, to prove the case, and it was with interest that I listened to the contribution on proposition to amend that list. However, realizing that would be probably difficult to do you feel that the concept of prohibited subsidies is any way useful in the context that we're speaking of? So I refer to the list of OECD subsidies and state interventions that we saw in Professor O'Connor's contribution, or do you feel that everything or most of it falls outside? And I think keeping in mind that most of the overcapacity in China is focused on export subsidies being. So do you think this is helpful in our case at all, or in the interpretation, or not at all? That's what I wanted to ask you.
Thank you for the question. So when I was looking at what we might want to add to the list of prohibited subsidies, I was looking specifically at which subsidies are primarily responsible for generating the overcapacity, and it was the financing and the LTARs. And so that was where I focused. The OECD list, which is a little bit broader, you could add some of those to the list as well. Export subsidies are already a prohibited subsidy. But what I was looking at was, can we how best do we address the subsidies causing the overcapacity crisis? And frankly, if you get at the financing and the LTARs, that takes up a significant number of what was on that list to begin with. So,
I think that's a very interesting and useful question. WTO may be doing a lab experiment in this with fish subsidies. So that's on the agenda perhaps for Buenos Aires, where the focus of that is flatly prohibited subsidies. Quite a wide range of them, and some of them would look familiar in this area. And the problem in fishing subsidies is overcapacity. There are too many boats catching too many fish, so which is not that different than what we're looking at. As I think Karl pointed out, so the problem is not Chinese overcapacity designed for export. It's just if you have 1.2 million tons and you happen to export an additional 5%, it's a lot of steel. And as I said, no one anticipated this, where a country exporting a relatively not small, but not a huge percentage of its production could be exporting a huge amount in terms of world markets. And
Sorry, just to go back to your other question. So the Chinese aren't exporting primary aluminum, but they are exporting the semi-finished aluminum. And the VAT rebate is set up in a way to facilitate the export. But what's really driving the additional exports isn't so much the VAT rebate as it is the excess capacity. It has to go somewhere, and the VAT rebate just contributes a few extra dollars to push it out the door.
But it's an interesting point. So no one had focused on this, to be blunt. It's one thing you would consider in any rewrite of the agreement would be rebating differential amounts of VAT. And I could make an argument that's already prohibited as an export subsidy, but the fact that no one's brought a case suggests there's reluctance.
Well, in the U.S., obviously, we're one of the few countries that we don't have a VAT, and we find it very difficult to countervail differential VAT in our own legal system, so.
Yeah, but if you were starting from scratch, you would probably put that on the list. But go back to the whole concept of prohibited. This is a practical question, because you're giving up the injury test, and there are some situations, the fishery discussion suggests, where yes, you want to do that. So you don't discard that. I mean, it's met with horror when you suggest adding to the list in some quarters, but it's a practical question of, are there some things we can all agree on? And again, I always add, do we do it, and do we plan to do it ourselves sometime, before I leap into that, but it's a tool. So if you delve deeper, A has been quite useful, the ban on export subsidies. The ban on import substitution or input subsidies has not worked at all because of problems of proof. So without getting into details of subsidies documents I have seen in the U.S., people skirted, but, you were given that money with a clear understanding you're going to use local inputs. I won't get into recent appellate body decisions. The appellate body does some weird things in subsidies, often favorable to the U.S., I hasten to add.
Just to clarify, the lending proposal that I had put up there was to treat as prohibited lending to non-creditworthy companies. Lending can still be countervailed even if the company is creditworthy, if it's provided by the government at below cost rates, but the company was creditworthy, so you're talking about measuring the subsidy with a different benchmark. But here, where you're lending to large sectors of companies that are clearly not creditworthy and who otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to that money, that ought to be expressly prohibited.
Well, our current Secretary of Commerce and President, in their prior lives, did exactly that, didn't they? So that gets you into questions of who decides these things and how, because commerce has its own way of determining creditworthiness, but markets do really strange things, as we've seen. But I'm not saying you don't do it. I'm just saying as you design a prohibited subsidy, you have questions of who decides, proof, etc. Maybe you don't allow it in countervail, but allow it in serious prejudice cases, maybe vice versa, whatever. I'm not telling you the answer. So you look at it in a very practical way, but it's a very good question. Thanks. Please.
May I make a very, very nasty comment? But I think in the last 1 hour we've been talking about China as if it is a market economy.
No,
I don't. It isn't. I don't think it is.
I don't think we have been.
It makes no sense to talk about individual subsidies because the whole system is a system of state distorted industry structures. Therefore, anything what's happening there is guided by the state. If we are talking about input prices, if you're talking about these debt equity swaps, etc., etc., all this feeding into the price competitiveness of these countries on the export markets. So it's not really necessary to look at if there's any export subsidy or not. I mean, the export subsidy is coming in at the steam coal level of the value chain. So this is the point I would like to make here. We are still getting ourselves tricked into this notion that China is a market economy, and I think it is not.
The original GATT solution for this problem was to say you can't apply dumping or countervail or subsidies. You set quantitative agreements. That was the Polish accession. I'm not saying that worked really well in the case of Poland, but so there's an argument that I won't get into whether China is or isn't a market economy and for what purposes. If you had a true non-market economy, yes, you're wasting your time trying to measure dumping or subsidies because the concepts don't work. You just come up with something quantitative. But that's ad hoc, or at least it's very country specific. So you don't write that into a general rule applying to everyone.
I mean, I said I'm not a lawyer. I'm talking here from the idealist economist perspective. But in the end, I would simply raise the point, let's talk about categories here, or at least think about these in the background, in the backs of our heads, what's going on there. And I would really like to make this point. It's not just if we can verify export subsidy, yes or no. The export subsidy is happening at the very first stage of the value chain.
Yeah, well, as you know, that the European Union is moving away from the categorization system in terms of what economies are and what they are not. I would like to go back to agriculture again. You know, I really am showing my age, but there are a lot of lessons, and I would invite the members to look at Article 9(1)(c) of the agricultural agreement, and what is a prohibited, what must come within the the agricultural export commitments. And there is the famous phrase there, which was used in the sugar case and the Canada dairy case, which is by virtue of government action. So subsidies which are benefits, if you like, which result from which are a consequence of government action. And here clearly the drafters of the agreement were looking to capture the common agricultural policy and as being a comprehensive policy to manage the food industry from farm to fork. And I think that's really what we do see today in China, is that management from idea to product, and not only the product itself, but the positioning of that common product on the domestic and global markets. So this idea of by virtue of government action, we already have it within the WTO, but it is restricted to agriculture, and if it could be expanded outside of that, I think it might be useful.
I mean, we've had two experiences. I don't regard them as too long ago because there aren't that many, of really comprehensive dismantling, both by the EU or its predecessor. One is the agriculture, the other was steel. The 1980s, the EU really cracked down on subsidies to steel within the internal market, despite complaints, which Karl may remember, that this was basically a freebie to the rest of the world, which wasn't imposing similar constraints. But it was quite seriously done. I note the comment that you have to take into account the social effects, or they will return to haunt you. But that doesn't mean you don't do it. There was a significant overcapacity problem in both areas.
And just from the lawyer's point of view, the European Union went as far as to actually allow the treaty which set the framework to expire.
Yeah. Comments, questions, solutions? Volunteers? None. Panelists, further final comments? I'm not going to stand between you all and lunch. Let me thank everyone here, and especially the panelists. Wonderful job, a lot of food for thought, some very good questions, so thank you.